In the summer of 1974, a boy sits cross-legged on a shag carpet, watching his father count dollar bills at the kitchen table under a humming yellow light. The television glows in the background, a news anchor talking about oil shortages and inflation, words the boy does not understand but feels in the room. His father folds each bill carefully, smoothing the creases with a calloused thumb, stacking them like bricks meant to build something permanent. The boy believes money is solid then, like the oak table beneath his elbows, like the house that smells faintly of coffee and motor oil. He grows up believing work is the spell that keeps everything standing, that 40 years of loyalty will keep the lights on forever. Decades later, that boy is 65, standing in his own kitchen, staring at a retirement statement that looks thinner than he imagined. There are 73 million people like him in this country, all told they could retire by 2030, all quietly doing the math at night. Almost half of them have no retirement savings at all, and many who do are holding less than $100,000. $100,000 once sounded like a fortress, but at $52,000 a year in expenses, it melts like ice in July. Groceries cost more, prescriptions multiply, and the idea of leisure begins to feel like a luxury reserved for someone else. He remembers thinking retirement would taste like salt air and margaritas, like freedom rolling down a coastal highway. Instead, it tastes like anxiety in the back of his throat when he opens the mailbox. Baby boomers were once called the wealthiest generation, the winners of a booming post-war economy that promised endless growth. But wealth is not evenly spread, and many carried divorces, medical bills, layoffs, and recessions like quiet debts across decades. He worked 46 years, believing each paycheck was a brick in a house that would one day shelter him. Now he sees cracks in the foundation, hairline fractures where savings were supposed to be. The first leg of the old retirement stool was always personal savings, the nest egg you were told to build patiently. Yet 45% of his generation never built one at all, or watched it shrink before it could grow. And the ones who saved modestly are discovering that time and inflation are ruthless architects. The boy on the shag carpet would not recognize the fear in the man's eyes as he folds his own bills under a different yellow light. In the 1930s, his own father had watched neighbors lose farms and factories, standing in bread lines with hats pulled low against winter wind. Years later, that same man would tell his son that Social Security was the first time the government felt like a promise kept. Each paycheck carried a small deduction, a quiet contribution into a fund meant to guard old age from humiliation. It worked for a while. Poverty among the elderly falling from over a third in 1959 to nearly 1 in 10 by the mid-1990s. When he was younger, the monthly Social Security statement felt distant, like a lighthouse he would one day sail toward. More than 90% of retirees now depend on those checks as their primary source of income. And here's the part nobody talks about. The fund that once felt like a fortress has been paying out more than it takes in since 2010. The largest generation in American history poured money into the system for decades, supporting those before them. Now they are retiring in waves, and there are fewer workers standing behind them, fewer hands feeding the same machine. Projections say the reserve fund could be depleted by 2034, leaving payroll taxes to cover only about 77% of promised benefits. That means a $1,000 check quietly becoming $770 without warning, without ceremony. He stares at his projected benefits online, watching numbers flicker like a weak signal. He remembers the way his father once folded bills with confidence, believing the system was steady. In the 1980s, money was quietly borrowed from the trust fund for other priorities, replaced with government IOUs. Trillions were promised back on paper, but paper does not pay for groceries. Since 2019, the gap between what Social Security has promised and what it can pay has widened by nearly $10 trillion. For every dollar collected in payroll taxes, roughly $2 in future promises now sit waiting. He wonders what a promise is worth when it is passed from one generation to the next like an unpaid bill. The boy on the shag carpet believed grown-ups had built something unbreakable, something that would not bend with time. In the late 1970s, he took his first real job, believing loyalty to one company would carry him like a train on fixed tracks. Back then, pensions were still spoken of with reverence, as if retirement income were something earned and then guaranteed. Older coworkers would joke about fishing trips and front porches, confident their companies would send checks long after their last shift. Then, something shifted quietly in the early 1980s, a new plan introduced in conference rooms with polite applause. It was called a 401, and it moved the responsibility from the company's ledger to his own trembling hands. Suddenly, retirement was no longer a promise from an employer, but a bet placed in the stock market. Participation in pensions fell sharply over the decades, while defined contribution plans like the 401 steadily rose. Companies loved the change, shedding risk like an old coat and handing it to employees who barely understood compound interest. At first, the market soared, and statements grew fat during the bull runs of the 1980s and 1990s. He watched his balance double, then triple, feeling brilliant without ever changing his behavior. He told his wife they were ahead of schedule, that retirement might come early, that maybe Florida was not a fantasy. Then the dot-com bubble burst, and numbers that once climbed began to fall with sickening speed. He refreshed his account late at night, watching $1 million collapse to half that in months. Friends who had submitted retirement paperwork quietly returned to work, their pride folded away like unused brochures. And still, the fees kept humming in the background. Small percentages siphoned off each year. 2 or 3% sounded harmless, barely noticeable against optimistic projections. But over 25 years, that modest fee could quietly erase hundreds of thousands of dollars from a portfolio. An American family can lose around $155,000 in 401 key fees over a lifetime. Even worse, more than half of actively managed funds fail to beat the market they promised to outperform. The boy who believed in brick-by-brick security now realizes he was stacking sand against a rising tide. By 2024, nearly 12,000 Americans turn 65 every single day, stepping quietly into a chapter that feels less certain than advertised. Fidelity reported the average 401 key balance dropped 23% in a single quarter of 2023. Just as many approached retirement. He watches financial news in the evening, volume low, as analysts debate volatility like it is weather. Meanwhile, life expectancy has nearly doubled since the late 1800s, giving him more years than any generation before. More years means more birthdays, more anniversaries, more mornings with coffee on the porch. It also means more years that must be funded, more decades where the paycheck no longer arrives. Economists call it the old age dependency ratio, the number of retirees supported by every 100 working adults. In many developed countries, that ratio hovers around 28, already straining public systems. In the United States, it is projected to climb toward 50 by 2075, nearly one retiree for every 2 workers. He imagines a bridge built for light traffic now carrying twice the weight it was designed to hold. Younger families are struggling with housing, childcare, education, and stagnant wages. Many are choosing to have fewer children or none at all, quietly altering the future workforce. Social programs depend on growth, on each generation being slightly larger than the last. Without that growth, the math tightens and promises become heavier to carry. He once believed retirement expenses would shrink, no more daily commutes or impulsive gadgets. But healthcare rises like an incoming tide, steady and indifferent. A healthy 65-year-old couple may need around $275,000 for medical costs in retirement, and nearly 70% of baby boomers will require some form of long-term care. A nursing home can cost $8,000 or more per month, a number that feels abstract until you multiply it by years. He remembers the boy on the carpet, thinking old age was simply a slower, gentler version of adulthood. Medicare helps with doctor visits and hospital stays, but it does not cover the long months inside an assisted living facility. Medicaid will help, but only after assets are nearly gone, when savings have been spent down to qualify. Many middle-class retirees find themselves suspended in between, too wealthy for aid, yet too poor for comfort. Since 2015, more than 1,000 nursing homes have closed, some operating at a loss, others unable to find enough staff. He drives past one such building in his town, windows dark, a faded sign still promising compassionate care. 70% of his generation will need some form of long-term care before the end. Oh, $8,000 a month, sometimes more, for a room with fluorescent lights and scheduled medications. He does the math again at his kitchen table, pencil tapping where his father's once did. Some say the final safety net will be family, adult children stepping in where systems fail. But Generation X and millennials are already juggling mortgages, student loans, and unstable careers. Many households cannot survive on a single income anymore, leaving little room for unpaid caregiving. A study once found that caregivers over 50 can lose more than $300,000 in lifetime income and benefits. The cost is not only financial but emotional. The quiet exhaustion of managing appointments and midnight emergencies. There are moments, whispered and shameful, when a caregiver longs for relief that only loss can bring. He does not want to become that weight on his children's shoulders, that silent calculation in their monthly budget. And yet he knows they are all standing on the same bridge, spanning past promises and future uncertainties. Baby boomers carried their parents across, trusting the planks would hold when it was their turn. Now the boards creak, and Generation X stands in the middle, supporting weight from both directions. The boy on the shag carpet believed the adults had engineered something permanent. The man under the yellow light understands now that every generation becomes a bridge, hoping it does not crack before the crossing is complete.